Hello all, and welcome to this seminar on learning and development and the power of change. My name is Chris, and I work for a company called Emergn. We are a global digital business services firm, and we help some of the world's most respected companies develop their most promising ideas into valuable products and customer experiences faster. And learning and development is a significant part of our business. Through the course of this short seminar, I'll talk to you a little about the workforce landscape, about creating strategic alignment between the business and learning and development, about this idea of resiliency and creating more resilient businesses, and close by talking a little bit about how to encourage learning in the flow of work. You've probably heard of at least one of the great R's shown on the slide here. But to summarize all of these, there can be absolutely no doubt that the world of work has changed dramatically, and as a result, the workforce is less stable and less certain than it has been before. But despite all of these issues, we have actually learned a lot about our organizations over the last few years as we've taken on these challenges and identified opportunities to improve how we do things. Through all of this change, though, one thing has almost certainly remained unchanged. The most valuable asset of a 21st century institution, whether business or non-business, will be its knowledge workers and their productivity. This quote from Peter Drucker from all the way back in 1959 is as true today as it was then. So if our people are our most important asset, then you could say that in lots of ways, the goal of learning and development functions has remained unchanged too. How do we build, support, and retain a capable workforce that is able to deliver for our organization? Every business is undergoing a transformation of some description, whether it's the ubiquitous digital transformation, whether it's organizational restructures, mergers, acquisitions, pivoting to new customer segments or products. Every company is seeking to change, to find that little bit of an edge that sets them apart. Now, these transformations are, of course, difficult and complex, and very often there's more than one happening at any given time. And many of these transformations will not end up delivering the hoped for results. In our experience, even those organizations that are successful within their transformations, they often don't last. They often kind of fizzle out somewhere along the way. At Emergn, we believe that transformation and learning are two sides of the same coin. Ensuring the persistence and longevity of transformation efforts should be the main focus of learning and development professionals. That's why the word forever appears so prominently in the mission of our company that you see displayed on the screen here. When it comes to understanding learning and development, we believe in doing our own research and in not relying on the work of other firms, on the stats that other firms put out there. So in the summer of 2022, Emergn partnered with an independent research firm, and we surveyed more than 1,200 professionals across the UK and the United States. And this survey focused kind of at two levels: on the opinions of learners, so those at management level and below, and on the opinions of leaders, specifically IT directors, HR leaders, people with responsibility for overseeing workplace training. I pulled a couple stats from that report, but I actually prefer to look at the flip side of these stats. So we learned that 41% of leaders did not believe their workplace training programs were effective. And we also learned that 50% of learners feel the same, that their workplace training programs were effective. But perhaps most alarmingly, there are a significant number of leaders out there, almost 1 in 10, who believe that their learning programs were effective, but their own employees disagree with them. Now, that's not a great position to be in. And so when we dived deeper into the reasons behind this, we consistently heard from both leaders and learners that they weren't clear on why the learning they were being asked to get involved in was important. Which sort of leaves us in learning and development with a fairly obvious question. How confident are you that the learning you're being asked for is right for your company? To think a bit more about this, I've got a simple example for us. A quick question. How many animals of each kind did Moses take into the ark? Take a little second to think about it. It's 2, right? But actually, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, Moses didn't build an ark. Noah did. And in fact, even beyond that, the book of Genesis is not entirely clear about how many animals Noah was asked to take along. But we sort of all instinctively know that the animals went in 2 by 2. At first glance, the answer to this question seems obvious. It's only when we stop, consider it, think about it a bit more, that we realize how far off we might be. Very often we go with our gut instinct or our own experience when it comes to deciding what learning programs to offer. After all, people wouldn't ask for training unless there was a good need, right? Unless it was for something important. And on the flip side, if there was a skills gap in our organization, you'd think that we'd be told about it. You'd think that people would be screaming it from the rooftops. But our research and experience suggests that that isn't always the case, and that frequently we find learning and development leaders are focusing on the wrong things. So if we can't necessarily trust our initial impressions, our gut instinct, when it comes to planning learning and development programs, how do we decide on what's important and what isn't? Resources in this world are always more limited than we would like them to be. So how do we make sure that we're investing our money and our time in the most important things? Well, for Emergn, the answer lies in understanding strategic alignment. We believe that learning and development is the hidden strategic partner within your organization. If training doesn't map to strategy, then somewhere along the way, we're missing the mark. Now, how do we ensure that there is that strategic alignment then between our L&D programs and the business priorities? What you see on the screen here is a screenshot of a template we use with product owners, with product managers, to help them ensure that their product's vision, goals, and the metrics they're using align with the mission and the strategic priorities of their companies. It's one of the first things we teach new product owners and product managers. We expect them to be using this daily. We expect them almost to be able to recite their version of this in their sleep. It's constantly reviewed. It's visible to everybody in the organization. And it makes sure that where they're investing their money is going into the right places and it's contributing to the achievement of the company's goals. It starts with the company level, outlining the company mission and strategic themes, and cascades down through the product's vision, the product's goals, and the product metrics. Now, what would an equivalent view of this look like in the world of learning and development? Well, it might look something like this. As with the previous template, the company's mission and strategic themes are arrayed prominently along the top. But this template casts down to the portfolios of products or projects that are planned to deliver against those strategic outcomes. Against each portfolio, we've mapped the skills gaps, those that might exist at the moment, what learning interventions are planned to address those skills gaps, and very importantly, the measures, how we're going to know if we've been successful or not in bridging those skills gaps. Whilst we see this kind of mapping happening with some of the L&D teams that we work with, too often we find that it doesn't exist or it isn't clear for us anyway. Some L&D leaders simply haven't thought about learning in this way. But very often, learning and development leaders are brought into discussions on strategy too late, if at all. And so they're forced into taking a more reactive role, responding to skills issues as they arise or as they start to affect us, as opposed to proactively managing those in line with the company strategy. And even where this alignment has been considered, often it sits within the heads of a handful of people. It isn't clear for everybody to see. At Emergn, we would advocate investing the time in getting the appropriate leaders from both business and learning and development together in a room around a whiteboard, visualizing this for your organization. Now, this template is just one way you might do it. There may be better ways of visualizing it for your company, but a visual here is very important for a number of reasons. Firstly, it helps us identify where there are gaps in the learning programs we're planning to offer today. If there's a skills gap associated with a strategic theme and we don't have a plan for how to address it, that's something we need to think about. It makes it easier for us to explain the significance of learning interventions to the people we're asking to take them. We're more likely then to get their buy-in and their participation. It's also easier to justify and retain investment if it's clear of the link between a learning intervention and the strategy it's supporting. It's much easier to have a discussion with a leader about whether something should be cut or not cut if we can clearly articulate the impact that would have on the business's strategy. But perhaps most importantly, it keeps learning and development practitioners focused on tangible business outcomes. If we've got a learning and development offering out there that doesn't align with one of our company's strategic themes, we should really be asking ourselves, is it important, or is there something else we should be focusing on instead? Now, understanding how your learning and development plan fits in with the corporate strategy is obviously hugely important. But if there's one thing we've learned about strategies over the last few years, it's that they change. They change frequently and they change dramatically. And of course, this creates real challenges for our workforces. As strategies change in response to the world out there or in response to changes in the market, they exert pressure upon our workforce. Sometimes this demands changes to the composition of the workforce and the makeup of our teams, but very often the change is about the work that's being undertaken and how our people approach it. The workforce has to flex, adapt, mold itself in order to deliver on that adjusted strategy. But there is a limit to the elasticity of people. We can only be pushed and stretched so much before we're going to snap. Understanding where that limit is and delivering training and support so that people can be more comfortable up to and at times even beyond that limit is where great L&D functions separate themselves from good L&D functions. In preparing for a more uncertain world, there are hard skills that we need to build, and L&D leaders are generally pretty good at getting on top of those. Today, those might be cloud computing skills or AI skills, data analysis, machine learning, whatever it might be for your organization, but the great L&D functions are thinking beyond that. The terrifying thing about the world of work that we operate in today is that the rate of change we're experiencing right now is the slowest it's ever going to be again. It only gets faster from here. Now, one of the enduring qualities that we believe separates high-performing organizations from the rest of the pack is their attitude towards change. If your people see change as something to be afraid of, something to avoid, perhaps even something to oppress, then we think you're in for a fairly rough and uncertain future. If your people see the opportunity that comes along with change, then you're far more likely to stay relevant and even to thrive. At Emergn, we describe those organizations as resilient. But what does that mean in practice, and what does it mean for learning and development? Well, we see there being 4 common traits in resilient organizations, regardless of their industry or their geography. They can build effective teams, they encourage experimental mindsets at all levels, they're customer obsessed, and they're driven by data. Now, we'll go through each of these in turn and just think a little bit more about what that means for learning and development. Building effective teams. The nature of complex work is such that our most challenging problems are unlikely to be solved by any single individual. That's going to take teams. But teams are more than just groups of people thrown together for a bit. Effective teams have a shared vision and purpose. They have complementary skill sets, and they have the right balance of direction and autonomy. Learning and development plays a huge part in building effective teams, and to do this, learning and development leaders should be thinking about how they can build communities that share knowledge and skills to create more cross-functional teams. It's simply unacceptable nowadays for people to hoard information or to hide things away from their colleagues. We've got to be better at sharing the knowledge that we have. And linked to that, how do we encourage individuals to step outside their specialisms towards more T-shaped skill sets? While their specialisms are important, we want to encourage people to think about a broad and shallow understanding of everything that's happening around them, not necessarily to the extent that they can do those roles, except maybe in an emergency, but certainly to the extent that they can collaborate with those roles most effectively to deliver better outcomes. How can our teams be more agile? And when I say agile here, I mean more reactive, more responsive, more flexible, as opposed to following any particular framework. And how can we support leaders to build both accountability and psychological safety within their teams? For lots of leaders, this leadership style is alien to them, but it's actually so important in making sure that our teams are effective. Secondly, encouraging experimental mindsets at all levels. Most organizations are optimized for the day-to-day running of their business. That's how they've made their money so far. But too few organizations are set up to be truly innovative. Being innovative means being willing to try stuff out, being able to learn from it. But this is much easier said than done. And in many cases, this involves breaking or unlearning habits that we formed over long careers. We should be thinking about how we can create a mindset that encourages the sharing and challenging of ideas. We have to be open to ideas from all areas of the business, but there is such a thing as a bad idea. We want colleagues to be critical friends, to challenge us on things so that we can focus our efforts on our best ideas. How can we help leaders be more comfortable with taking risk and ultimately more comfortable with failing? Trying and failing is by far and away the best way to learn. It's the way that we all learn to ride our bicycles. And even the best venture capital firms in the world out there expect about 90% of their investments to fail. That wouldn't fly with most of our companies. That attitude is simply unacceptable. And yet high-performing organizations are operating more in that manner. So with that in mind, then, how do we encourage structured innovation throughout the organization so that we can identify and crystallize great ideas quickly and equally quickly abandon those ideas that don't pan out? So then how do we teach teams to design these low-cost, low-effort experiments to test their hypotheses? If you'll allow me a quick digression, one of the four traits I talk about here, personally, I view this one as the most significant when it comes to being prepared for the future. And it's an area where Emergn too places a huge amount of emphasis. In fact, this is so important to us that we recently announced an alliance with a company called Strategyzer. If you haven't heard of Strategyzer, you may well have heard of Alex Osterwalder, their CEO, or you may have heard of the business model Canvas, which is used across all sorts of areas of business transformation. Strategyzer are world leaders in creating innovation cultures and building innovation practices within organizations. And we're really excited about bringing their thinking and our thinking together so that our clients get so much better about taking ideas all the way through to impact. Our third trait is customer obsession. We should have our customers at the heart of absolutely everything that we do. But all too often, as we immerse ourselves in the world of work, we feel the pressure to get stuff done. It's really easy for teams to lose sight of why we're here. And of course, this issue becomes more and more challenging the further removed our teams are from our customers. So how then can we embed an intimate knowledge of our customer at all levels of our organization, from our board members and our most senior directors, all the way down to our newest hires? And how can we help even non-customer facing teams build empathy with those customers? And I choose the word empathy deliberately. We want to go beyond the sort of classic customer profile stats of gender and age and average purchase amount, and really understand who our customers are, what their pain points are, and what they're hoping to achieve when they work with us. With that in mind, then, what techniques, what tools can we teach our teams to better understand their customers? Is it about journey mapping, story mapping, value propositions? What are the techniques we can arm them with so that they can get a real handle on who their customers are? And finally, being data obsessed. We've talked already about how sometimes our gut instincts or our initial impressions can lead us astray. Fortunately, or sometimes unfortunately, most of us have access to almost unlimited data within our organizations. Again, this presents huge opportunity alongside huge challenges. So we should be thinking about how we can encourage teams to use data to challenge their assumptions. We want our teams to prove it, not just believe it when it comes to new ideas or what they're working on. How do we help teams see through the mountains of data out there to really glean actionable insight? It is very easy for important details to get lost in the storm of Google Analytics or clouds of usage data. How can we help teams find those points that are really significant? And how can we use data to help make more objective decisions? Ultimately, then, when things maybe don't go quite right, prevent a blame culture developing. Now, I've thrown a lot at you over the last few slides, and as much as I've tried to keep it simple, you're probably thinking that all of this seems like it might be all but impossible to get right. And I'd suggest it's actually a bit simpler than you might think. This doesn't need to involve armies of consultants and decks of hundreds of slides with organizational charts and operating models sketched out. To make things real and tangible for teams, we should look to distill this down into sets of clear and simple principles that can be applied to almost any challenge. What you see on the screen here, these are ours. This is our VFQ philosophy. Deliver value early and often. That's where this customer obsession comes in. How do we get more valuable product into the hands of our customers more quickly? Optimize the flow of work end to end, something that effective teams are thinking about all the time. How do we reduce handoffs or delays? How do we reduce dependencies? How do we make sure that teams have everything they need to be really successful? And discover quality with fast feedback, where our experimental mindset and our ability to use data help us ensure that we're building the right things and building them in the right way. By emphasizing principles like this over any particular framework, what we're doing is we're leaving the people closest to the work to decide how best to tackle that work. And if they keep these principles in mind when they're making these decisions, then they're not going to go far wrong. Teaching principles like this, though, is only the start of the race. Embedding it is the real challenge, and this is much more of a marathon than a sprint. L&D leaders should be thinking about how to encourage learning in the flow of work. In our experience, impactful learning doesn't solely happen in courses. In fact, courses on their own, we tend to find don't move the needle very much. Making learning part of people's work is what makes it stick. And our research backs this up. 42% of learners said that not having time was the biggest blocker they had to engaging with the training they'd been delivered. People simply don't have time to sit in constant courses or complete hours of online training. Put simply, learning while working is the only realistic way that this happens. To finish things off then, to close, I'd like to leave you with a few questions for you to reflect on as leaders in your learning and development functions. Do you fully understand your organization's strategic direction? How connected are to it? What part could you play in shaping it? Or as a very minimum, how can you help communicate it throughout your organization so that it's clear to everybody involved? What skills does your organization and actually your L&D function need to be truly resilient? What is that going to look like for you and for your company? And what can you do to build those skills within your organization? How will you know when you get there? How will you know when you are more resilient than you are today? What will that look like for you? And lastly, think about forever. What can you do in your companies to make learning a continuous lifelong activity, not something we do off the side of our desks? What is your organization's learning culture? How can we improve that? How can we make sure it's embedded to everybody in our organization? Thank you all for attending this seminar. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or any of my colleagues at Emergn. Our mission is to improve the way that people and companies work forever. And as we've seen, learning and development is really critical in making that happen. Thank you all again. I'm Chris Gray.